time for your Arizona Insiders.
Oh, sweet.
Each weekday, Wildcats Radio 1290 brings you all the latest news and opinions of U of A basketball. So bear down, Tucson, and let's talk Arizona basketball. Our Arizona Insiders are brought to you by Coors Light, official corporate sponsor of Arizona Athletics. There's nothing like game day in Arizona.
Coming to you live from Los Angeles. He was at Crypto.com Arena today as the Arizona Wildcats practiced ahead of the Sweet 16 matchup against Clemson. Brian, paint us a picture of the vibe today in Los Angeles.
Well, I think everybody's excited to be here. You're one of the 16 teams remaining in this tournament. I think when the season started, there were about 360 teams playing Division I basketball, 16 remain, and so you can't help but be excited if you're a player or a fan to be at this juncture with a chance, to get to the Elite Eight on Saturday. But, of course, you got to play them one game at a time. So I get the impression the guys are well rested. They were able to get home, of course, a little earlier maybe than these other teams did in terms of travel. They had the shortest travel of the four teams that are here, and so for that matter, I think it's a great situation to be in. And as Tommy Lloyd said today, it's kind of like a regular season game. You play Thursday, and, of course, in this case, you hope you play Saturday, but that would be like any Pac-12 weekend. So I think the guys are in good shape, good spirits, ready to go. It doesn't guarantee they're going to win the game, but you can't ask for a better setting in terms of being prepared and being in a good position to get a victory.
I know, Brian, we've talked about that every year in terms of the fact that these tournaments are set up Thursday, Saturday, Friday, Sunday, and it's very similar to what, the Wildcats have experienced within conference play. Some of these other teams maybe have a different structure in terms of how they go about their regular seasons. Have you found that there's an advantage there? Maybe what other teams have said about how they try to adjust to this format?
Well, I think most of it has to do with travel, probably not as much the regular season. I mean, there may be some truth to the fact that a lot of these conferences don't play, 2 games in 3 days, that usually they're spread out a little bit more. But they've all played in conference tournaments where they're playing game after game after game. And so, like North Carolina State, for example, have played, and won 5 games in 5 days. And so I think that gets you prepared for a situation like this, and probably a luxury if you played in a conference tournament and played more than 2 games in a row, because now you get a day off in between games, at least if you win the Sweet 16 contest. I think it more comes back to the travel and how to get here. And you take a look at Clemson. I mean, they played in Memphis on Sunday. They flew home. They were home for about 12 hours and then took the cross-country trip here to Los Angeles. And their coach said today, he says, our practice wasn't very good yesterday because, we didn't have our legs. And you can understand that after, that type of travel. Arizona was home on Saturday night, and we flew in yesterday evening, and, it's an hour flight from Tucson to Los Angeles. And so, they were in their hotel rooms here by, I think we were probably here by 5:30 or 6. And, you just feel a lot more refreshed and ready to roll. So I think that might have more to do than what the season has gone on in terms of the scheduling.
Brian Jeffries, the voice of the Wildcats, is joining us from Los Angeles, Arizona, and Clemson in the Sweet 16. And Brian, we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves in looking ahead, but I did want to ask you something that Jacob and I were talking about in the opening segment, and that is how there's so much talk in this fan base and around this program as it relates to Arizona versus Duke, but you don't necessarily hear that much as it relates to Arizona versus North Carolina. And these are two teams that have played some pretty important ball games across the history if we get to that point on Saturday.
Well, I mean, the first one that comes to mind, of course, was 1988 when Arizona beat North Carolina at the Kingdome in Seattle. That was the regional championship game, and that put the Wildcats in the Final Four for the first time in school history. So you can start right there. And then, of course, you go to 1997 when they beat them in the semifinals on their way to a national championship. They played a home-and-home schedule before. They played on neutral courts before. And so, I mean, it's a rivalry between two teams that are on opposite sides of the country, but and yet have captured the imagination of college basketball fans everywhere because of their success. And North Carolina, is one of the most successful college basketball programs in history. And there's a line drawn there because, I was talking to some of their guys today, and they were, going through, they've won 6 national championships, been to the Final Four 21 times, most of any school. I could go on from there. But I think just from a college basketball fan perspective, these are two teams that, maybe ought to play more often because of their status in the sport. But, they've had some big games before. And if they do meet on Saturday, and I say if, then that's going to be very well anticipated. The guy, I felt kind of sorry for him today because Caleb Love was surrounded by media in the locker room today, and they were all North Carolina media because, they're anticipating that possibility on Saturday. And, of course, he doesn't want to talk about that game because they've got another one tomorrow, and if they don't win tomorrow, then there won't be that return game or whatever you want to call it coming up on Saturday.
Well, when you look at the Clemson Tigers, Jada brought up the point that P.J. Hall is the kind of big man that could really cause problems for Arizona because of his ability to step away from the basket, bring Umar Ballo away from the basket. He can hit the three-point shot on occasion, and really how that maybe potentially could open up Clemson's offense to attack the Wildcats. How do you think the Arizona deals with that in this game?
Well, I'm going to say it's almost a carbon copy of what we saw last weekend against Dayton, because that's exactly how Dayton tries to run their offense. I mean, it's certainly not a similar team, but Deron Holmes, their big guy. He put up I think 4 3-pointers in that game, and he's a guy again that can step out. And PJ Hall is exactly the same way. Now they're different players. Hall is not nearly as mobile. Now he's got great footwork, but he's not as mobile as Deron Holmes was. So it's every team's different, and this is a different set. But the thing about North Carolina, along with Holmes, or I should say Hall, at his size at 6'10" and about 240, he's got 2 other guys inside with him that are not quite as big, but they are plenty big. And so that whole front line, I think, is going to be a real key to this. They talk about guard play in the tournament, but I think Arizona's front against Clemson's front is going to be a real key factor. And Hall's also had some foul issues. He was asked about that today, and Umar Ballo is very good at drawing fouls, and that's something that Tommy Lloyd works on all the time. And so, you don't know how the game's going to be called, but it wouldn't hurt if Arizona could get him into foul trouble.
Brian Jeffries, the voice of the Wildcats, is our guest. Arizona Clemson in the Sweet 16 on Thursday. Brian, last week, one of the things we were talking about as it relates to Umar Ballo is just maybe his aggressiveness has kind of come out a little bit more on the defensive end. We're starting to see him block more shots. Curious as to why you think that is, because we really didn't see that from Umar early in the season.
Well, I think it's just a matter of, as the season has gone on, I think he's, physically better than he was at the beginning of the year. And you give a lot of credit to Chris Rounds and his work in the weight room. And that's why these guys have stayed healthy this year, knock on wood. And also the other thing is he's a senior. And I think every senior this time of the year, they know it's their last go-round. It's their last chance. And it's not that they haven't tried to play hard previous to that, but there's that extra incentive there. I think you see Pella Larson going through the same thing right now, and Caleb Love and Keyshawn Johnson. I mean, they all know that this is their last chance at this, and they're going to leave it all on the court. And Pella talked about effort today. He said that's what's going to decide the game on Thursday is effort, which team can put out most. And when you have an older team, I think they understand that probably a little bit more than a younger team. And so we'll see how it pans out, but. Both these teams, they have some similarities, but at the same time, obviously, they've got differences, and I think it's going to be a great matchup. You look at it on paper, and you say, there's a reason why they both got here, and I'm looking forward to see how it runs out tomorrow.
You obviously travel with the team, Brian. If you got a chance to kind of maybe get to know Pella a little bit, and what's he like away from the court?
Well, probably a lot like he is on the court. He's very steady. Very mature, very level-headed, doesn't get too high or get too low. I think that's one thing I've noticed about him this year is that, like everybody, he's had a bad game here or there. And when you see him after the game, he's not hanging his head. He's not sulking. he understands there's another game to play and that he's got another chance to get himself back where he was, prior to that bad game. And I think that's one thing that stands out more than anything, being around him, where, some guys, it's hard for them to shake a bad game. But that's not been his case. And I think, again, just his experience and all the games that he's been through, that he understands that, that's part of it. It's, you play a lot of basketball games, over 30 games now, and if you dwell too much on one, be it good or bad, then it can affect you down the road. So I would say steady. That's probably the best way to describe Pella.
Brian, this is something we really haven't necessarily talked about at length, but with the move next year to the Big 12 and kind of maybe a shifting of Arizona from the West more to the middle of the country, are they still going to be considered, you think, a top seed in the West with the good teams, or could we eventually see Arizona teams be the number one seed in the South or one of those other regions outside of the West?
Well, if you're a top 4 seed, the way the committee has worked is that they're going to keep you as close to home as possible if they can. And now a lot of it does come down to seeding. So they will look at that once they put that 1 through 68 or 1 through 64, however you want to look at it. Once they put that, I call it the S curve, put together, then they start at the top with the number 1 seeds and say, because you are a number 1 seed, we're going to, if at all possible, and I think almost without a doubt it happens this way, you're going to be as close to home as possible. And that was Arizona. They went to Salt Lake. Let's see. North Carolina went to Charlotte, etc. That's just the way they like to work it. And, of course, the sites are different every year. But to answer your question, I think Arizona would still be, if they're a number 1 seed, they would still be in the West. They would keep them as close to home as possible, no matter where those West sites are down the road. You can always be a high seed in another region, like the Wildcats were a couple of years ago when they were the 2 seed in the South, and that's just kind of the way it worked out. But remember, with the pod system, they still got to play that first weekend in San Diego.
Yeah.
So again, it goes back to the fact that they try and keep you as close to home as possible if you're a top 4 seed.
All right, Brian, your biggest key to a victory for Arizona?
Well, I think it's battling that front line of Clemson between P.J. Hall, who I think has just had a tremendous season, Ian Shefflin, who some people look at as just kind of the face of the team, but the guy's 6'8", 240, and he can play. And I think the other guy to look out for is Jack Clark. He had some injury problems earlier. He's back in the starting lineup. He's 6'10", about 210. And so there you've got 3 guys that you're talking about that, have size inside. And then, you match that up with Arizona. And then let's just say, for example, that Umar and P.J. Hall are battling each other. Okay, now you've got Keyshawn Johnson against Jack Clark at 6'10", which means then Pella Larson might be guarding a guy who's 6'8". And that's where Clemson would have an advantage height-wise. Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to work out that way, and Tommy's going to change some guys up in terms of, who they guard, etc. But I think Arizona's versatility in guarding some bigger guys is going to come into play. We saw that last weekend when Keyshawn was playing the 5 a lot against Dayton, that he could handle himself just fine. And so those guys will be switching off. But I think Arizona's ability to limit those 3 are really going to be a key. Not that they can back off, the back court, because, they got a couple of guys there in Chase Hunter, who's having a great season, and Joe Girard, who's having his best season, the transfer from Syracuse. And so Clemson's a really good team, and everybody is right now. You can sit around and find weaknesses with every team, but I tell you what, if you got here, that means that you're playing your best basketball right now.
All right, it is the Wildcats and the Tigers. Tip-off at 4:09 on Thursday. Brian Jeffries will have the call with Ryan Hansen. Brian, you guys have a great call.
All right, thanks, David.
Brian Jeffries, the voice of the Arizona Wildcats.
Thanks to Coors Light for bringing you today's Arizona Insiders on Wildcats Radio 1290. Coors Light, official corporate sponsors of Arizona Athletics. There's nothing like game day in Arizona.